series of lectures, which I called retrospectives. I hope that this is the first in a series of series. The purpose of it is to look back at British architectural history in a way in order to look forwards. And I started this with a look at the people who Peter Cook called the Grunt group, who were a very important part of life in this school, and I think contributed greatly in the 60s, 70s and 80s to the condition of British architecture. For me, they have particular importance because I went to architecture school in 1975, and as one of my colleagues of that period pointed out to me earlier on today, the Red British Architecture AD came out in 1977. That was our second year, and had an absolutely fundamental importance to us as students in that period. On the front cover it had James Stirling's sketch of the Stats Gallery, inside construction photographs of that building as it came out of the ground in its concrete state, an almost Piranesian grandeur, but also kind of claustrophobia. But within that issue of AD, there was also a very complete, at that time, I thought, presentation of the work of Chris Cross, Ed Jones, Jeremy Dixon, Mike Gold, and others who were in a kind of broad constellation which had been called in this institution the Grunt group. In other contexts they were called variously the Cool School or the Lost Generation. The early work for people of my generation was particularly powerful in its kind of reclaiming of some of the devices of early modernist planning, the 1920s open row model of Gropius, Hilbersheimer and others, which was applied in the Runcorn housing competition entries, Netherfield housing, Coffee Hall housing at Milton Keynes, where a kind of the absolutist quality of Hilbersheimer's planning was married uncomfortably or comfortably, depending on your point of view, with a more picturesque British tradition as the parallel blocks sagged and moved through the landscape, inflected by hedgerows, lines of trees, village pathways, and other kind of more marginal devices. There were nods in the direction of Oud, or however you pronounce it, I never quite got it right, at the Hook of Holland, and Mart Stam with his laconic, beautiful essay in blue at the Weissenhof Siedlung. There were also nods in the direction of both Mies and Corbusier. The Smithsons had talked about Mies being great, but Corb communicating. It seemed to me that as a student in the 70s that it was possible somehow to believe that it could do both, that architecture could do both, and that there was an example set by these people. In more recent years, there was a particularly fruitful period teaching at the Royal College of Art under the direction of John Miller, which, again, for our generation, was incredibly powerful as architecture shifted. Leo Krier, Porphyrius, James Gowan, Ed Jones, Chris Cross, and others all brought together under one roof to really substantially inflect British practice. The redefinition of the Plan of Barcelona was a particularly powerful image of that period, and had, again, a great influence on us. It was for that reason, and also because of having a whole series of rather disjointed memories of presentations by the different people involved in this group in the 70s and 80s, that I can't remember whether it was at Cheltenham or whether it was at Portsmouth or whether it was somewhere in London, but as a student summer school, I remember a presentation of projects from the Royal College, including what I thought was quite lyrical and transitional piece by a student whose name I think had hope in it, I'm not sure, but it was a Sharrow-esque, to be polite about it, an object on top of a plaster base cut through with gold. And it seemed to me that that was catching British architecture at a moment when it was neither high-tech, nor was it leaning too heavily on European rationalism, nor was it too embedded in its own kind of interior world of the picturesque tradition, but it was something else, and it was going somewhere. Or having introduced them in this way, I'd like to hand this evening over to Christopher Cross. Next Friday, the lecture will be given by Mike Gold. The time has sadly been left out of the events list, but you'll find a pull-out piece, which I hope to repeat every week for the rest of the month, with a retrospective issue of this by Chris, to make a complete package of Grunt Group memorabilia. Mike will be speaking at 7 o'clock on Friday to finish in time for the AA Student Forum, Valentine's Party, or whatever that starts at 8 o'clock in the same evening. The following Friday, Jeremy Dixon will talk about the trajectory of his work and his relationships with other people within the group. The series will be concluded by Edward Jones, and the 25th of March, we hope at the end of that evening to have a dinner to celebrate this event. With that, I think I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. Well, it's slightly difficult to know how to handle this. And being the first speaker, I thought it might be best to give some kind of introduction to the scope, certainly of the earlier work, on which the other speakers will build. And they will, I think, more or less support the kind of things I'm saying. But I would expect that some would perhaps disagree quite strongly, especially Jeremy Dixon, perhaps. But if we just consider briefly the background to the work that we did together, and then perhaps look at examples of it, it's very important to me to be aware of the generosity of the AA as the base for things that happened. It is the most enlightened school, and its civilized atmosphere continues, and it's made many, many good things for me in my life, and I'm very grateful to the AA. As the people involved in this group, it's really a vague matter that we never thought we were a group, especially, or considered that we were called the Grunt Group. People sometimes say to me that either that I am a member or I was a member of the Grunt Group, and it's just to do with other people's ideas. As far as I'm concerned, we were colleagues and friends who at various times have worked together, not necessarily very coherently, and we're still friends. We see each other less now than we used to, but there is a lot of shared belief and concern between us. I suppose the person I see most or talk to most now is Ed Jones, but it was never a really tightly knit group, is something I would say as a start. But in terms of the AA background that sustained it, it was, for me, certainly coming to London from a very really narrow provincial background in Bristol, going to a tough grammar school, and coming to the amazing openness of the AA, intimidated at an interview by waiting outside a room where there was somebody in before me who finished his interview and came out carrying a model, and then went back in to get some more models, and then the person who was interviewing him helped carry out some more models, and there were about 12 or 15 models brought out of this room, and I just had a few ragged drawings as far as I could see. Anyway, I became a student in the school, and the early part of that period I don't think has much distinction to it, but I did make some very, very good friends, and a lot of that was to do with the business of students being all together in studios, which doesn't happen now as it used to. But many of my best friends now are the people who I got to know in the first year at the AA. The people who influenced us were not some of the people who were the very good teachers then, I'm afraid. It's remarkable how in retrospect, for instance, the presence of SMITHSON as a teacher was not appreciated, certainly by me. We had brilliant lectures, history and theory lectures, but they kind of passed over my head. I didn't care too much about them because from very early in the system, it was clear that the point of being there was to be in some way a modern architect and to learn about what to do from the base of the modern movement. We were introduced to what this might be about to some extent by our tutors in the first year. Graham Shankland lectured at the end of the first year, but the main influence, I think, of the possibilities that could be in the modern movement came from the Banham lectures, which were given I think in the second year. Banham was putting together the material for the theory and design book and talked from that directly in the school, and he was a very, very positive influence. Of the other influences, the most important in the early years was SMITHSON, who was a completely charismatic figure in crits, which were often mean and nasty in the AA. But those of us in earlier years got a kind of buzz upstairs that SMITHSON was doing something downstairs to the fourth year, or whatever it was, and we sort of came down to listen. SMITHSON was very, very powerful. But we were otherwise, I think, influenced by the celebrity speakers who came to the school, and they often came in relation to the AA convention of big dinners, that this room would have a big table set up with white tablecloths and waitresses in black with white pinnies and so forth, and after the dinner the students would come in and listen to Mies or whoever it was talking about their work, the cigar smoke. All that was very powerful. I rarely among students at the time took a year out at the end of the first 3 years. Most students went straight on through the school. It's convention in most schools except for the AA to take years out now, and I was rare in doing this. And I worked for Hull, Killick, Partridge and Amos, and came back to the AA to the fourth year with John Winter, who was very practical and brusque. But the major influence in those final 2 years of my program here came from Alan Cahoon, who I respect enormously as a teacher and a thinker, and still regard as an influence now. I think at that time the AA was not in a very strong position. It was possibly at one of its lowest ebbs in the last 30 or 40 years, and it was moving towards the period of disillusionment that led to the proposal to move to Imperial College, and the absolute state when John Lloyd wrote letters to students. This was after I'd left, but it got to a point where the head of the school wrote letters to the students advising that they seek places in other schools of architecture because the AA was unlikely to go on. The people who came together, and I was involved to some extent at that time to try and save the AA and invent financial equations and other arrangements that would allow the school to continue, laid the base for the Boyarsky years and the arrangements we have now with Alan Balfour. Anyway, the final 2 year period, just if we could launch into the slide arrangement. How do we adjust the lights? Needs a turn. Yeah, could we go back on the side there? This is a possibly embarrassing picture with a lot of hair from 1972 to introduce the protagonists. Ed Jones in the front, a kind of version of Carpo Marx, Mike Gold, Jeremy Dixon at the back, and just to touch on work. Hello, sorry. the work that certainly influenced me as I came through the final 2-year period, the work at Hull, Killick Partridge and Amis, I only had a connection with this at the level of helping with drawings and having to go to the site in Oxford to lay out the St Anne's College building with builders, which was a daunting prospect given its strange geometry. But I was at the time very, very influenced by the work of Wells Coates, and I subsequently did a thesis in the school here, a written thesis about Wells Coates. The finishing work that I did was a thesis. There was a thesis tradition at the AA that ran through most of the final year, and there was a worthiness about public housing, and there was a convention established in the school that this was the right kind of thing to do. I felt I was very much following in the footsteps of, for instance, Birkin Howard, Peter Rich and Martin Hacksworth, who did a major thesis the year before me, and there was a sort of competitiveness about the production of drawings. I think this came in at something like 22 drawings, and it was something that was about an amazing amount of hard work and commitment, driven by some ways slightly nutty ideas, but it was looking forward to some kind of quiet world where things would happen in a simple, ordered way. Robert Maxwell, when he wrote in the book that James Gowan put together, noted in relation to this scheme, he said that cool architecture is now making a decided re-entry. In place of romantic or frenzied silhouettes, the calm, rational envelope. I'll move towards the light. Many factors have contributed to this. Lionel March has favoured cool diagrams, YRM, cool cores, Cedric Price's coolness in all circumstances. There is renewed interest in rationality and rational frameworks. Harbrock and finally the 30s have begun to seem nostalgically attractive. The Grunt group, and he's referring then to the work at Milton Keynes, and he refers to the work at Runcorn, prefigured in their AA work from the period of 1961 to 64, of which this scheme is a fair example, what was to come, where the neutral technological space frame of the Weeks generation had had a Miesian cast to it. This coolness is decidedly Dutch in tone, uncompromising in layout, tender in detail. Trees here provide a necessary counterpoint to the regularity of the layout. They stand for the validity of the life without which the scheme is incomplete, the life without which the scheme is incomplete, and the regular geometry heartless without this. Although many critics will condemn the regularity as nothing but regimentation, regimentation is not the intention, but rather the creation of a steady background in front of which life can become more visible and more intelligible. And Maxwell has always been a remarkable supporter in what he's written about the work that we did. Referring to two other schemes of that time, a fourth-year scheme by Jeremy Dixon on the left, and a scheme he did with Fenella Dixon, a very inventive fourth-year project which has an AA preoccupation of the time, cars up the middle of a building with apartments around the edge. So you drive to your door and walk from the car park straight in. And it works within a spiral system with the flats overlapping at the corner. Ed Jones produced a standard welfare state brief, which was a project with Paul Simpson for a teachers training college at Swindon, and that's the project on the left. I think it's important to remember that we accepted the conventions of public building as being the obvious things to do. It never occurred to us that there was any problem with working with these, or that we would need to establish some kind of critical position in relation to what the welfare state program wished to try and achieve. And it was obvious to us that we should take part in it, and that the work we did in the school was a preparation for it. And at a certain level, there was very little difference between the work in the school and the work outside. And the situation that's developed in schools since, where there's some critical position to be established in the work in the school that is radically different or at variance to an external situation was the last thing that we ever considered. Mike Gold, in his final year project in 1964, produced this project, which was for a new site for University College Dublin, and it was rather nice that he did that, since we became quite involved with that school in years after this. In terms of built work, after I had finished at the AA, I had an immediate reaction to wish to have nothing at all to do with architecture and drawing boards, and I went and built something. I physically made a small project with a client. We worked on the site together, and we humped things round, we carried things and dug things and nailed things together, and I found it a very, very liberating experience. But it didn't last for that long. After 3 or 4 months I got bored, and I went to work with Alan Cahoon and John Miller, who were at that time working in Sackville Street. They were completing the Forest Gate School in East London and working on the project for new chemistry laboratories for Holloway College in South West London. And I greatly respect Alan and John, and I found it very, very valuable to work with them and work on their schemes. I haven't got information about them here. I don't think that I was really a contributor to them other than as an assistant. The work there lasted until the end of '65, and at that point the office was definitely starting to run into the ground. And Ed and I had an idea that we would try and promote ourselves very, very vainly through other offices, and we had an idea of what a successful office would be, and Mike Gold had characterized this as being Sidney Berman and Partners. I don't think there ever was an office called Sidney Berman and Partners, but that was the kind of name that an office that was always in the black would have. And what Ed and I did was we sat on the phone in the office one day when Alan and John were out, and we called up a series of really rather second-rate offices. I have to be careful what I say, I won't mention them, and said in effect, we're energetic and young, and we've got lots of ideas, you've got lots of work, why don't we come and do it for you? And within that was the suggestion that you're not very good at doing it. We could do it better. And most of them put the phone down. There was a particularly sort of sharp response from Clifford Culpin and Partners, I remember. But one of the people we included within this sweep was Frederick McManus and Partners. And old Frederick McManus, who was a very, very canny guy, didn't put the phone down. And he said, well, why don't you come and see me? And Ed and I went to see him. And the upshot of that was that we were invited to make proposals for a large site in Woolwich, which we presented over the space of a couple of weeks with a large model and various drawings. And it was a giant central area redevelopment site. And we had really no knowledge of how you might deal with a site like this at all, and spewed out funny shapes pouring down the site, but with a certain kind of verve which he admired. And following making this model, he invited us to join the office, and we began in the office working on a project for the Woolwich Polytechnic Hostel, which is here. And this was a scheme which Ed and I pursued first of all, and it went through a very large number of versions, starting as a low, double-stacked scheme, rather like an office building, but eventually changing to a kind of version of the Villa Savoie with a whole block of rooms up in the air above shared space, a whole block of student rooms facing south with the communal arrangements at the back. It's all predicated on absolutely minimum cost, simple student bedrooms, perhaps 2 meters wide, obviously inspired by the Unité versions as well. I should stress that in talking about this early work, that it was built at a time when, while there was a great optimism about doing work, and there was lots of work around, the budgets for doing work were absolutely minimal. So it was all about what the rock bottom way of stacking things might be. I worked with Ed on this project for a while, but then went off to work on other things, and he pursued it with Brendan Woods particularly. And what happened at the McManus office is that bit by bit other people came and joined. Jeremy Dixon came, Ed Jones came, Andrew Mahady came. There may be other people here. I think we got to a point of something like 16 people who sort of came into the office from our connection there. And we almost established a kind of separate office within the office. Woolwich now actually stands up quite well. These are buildings built for almost nothing, and they're 25 years old. And this is Woolwich last Sunday. Very, very quiet, very calm, very, very simple. All this work really is driven by the idea that architecture might be perhaps relatively straightforward and unbothered. Obviously, it was inspired by other work, and a strong influence on us was the Armée de Salut, as well as the other references that I've given, especially the early version for it when it was, well, the version as built when it had the glazed facade to the side, before they put the brise-soleil up. Other inspirations at the time that I think might be worth noting, David suggested there was a Dutch connection, trying to focus. And I never felt this was a major influence, but I did go to Holland, and among memorable experiences was staying in the Duiker Hotel Huiland. And Ed and I had on the wall, when we were working on the Woolwich project, the ground floor plan of the Duiker Hotel. And we regarded that as a kind of high point of inventive geometrical arrangements. We worked within fairly regular grids, but always dreamed in some way of being able to liberate ourselves from them. We were caught in the position of enjoying and liking simple things, but wishing in a way we could make more complicated things. These are important influences, I think, as well. The idea that very, very simple building arrangements might be all right, that you didn't actually have to fuss things up. That when we started to do this work, it was on the back of a period in this country in the 50s and early 60s where there was a lot of very bothered work. There was kind of silly juggling with shapes and a kind of British preoccupation that anything that was more than a limited length was in some way bad for you. And we used to search around for examples of big, simple arrangements. I remember one of our quests was finding very, very long, straight corridors. And the greatest achievement in this was the Royal Hotel in Bloomsbury, which Mike dug out as having, I think, a 576-foot long corridor with the bedrooms on one side and the bathrooms and lavatories on the other side. Now, I remember going to visit it early in the morning, creeping up the stair and looking down this corridor and seeing figures in dressing gowns, you know, one about 40 feet away, one about 200 feet away, going the other way, etc., etc., etc. And other people couldn't understand this preoccupation, but it was also founded on things like the observation of regular systems in London, which people value and enjoy, like Westbourne Grove or the Mall, which are actually very, very big scale. They have big dimensions to them. Just to go to another project, this is on the left a site in New Cross in East London, which I looked at with Adrian Sansom. And this was for a GLC project where there was a proposal on the right of the slide to build a major road to come over the New Cross Junction. This would be a big elevated road coming across here, the major junction on the right. And we were intrigued by the possibility that a way of fulfilling the brief might be to build a long, quiet terrace back from the road with a big garden and allow the road to move in front of the dwellings. It's a kind of naive idea in some ways, given the power of modern roads, but it perhaps is useful to remember that there was very, very little traffic at the time. It was quite rare to see many vehicles moving around, and roads didn't seem so threatening. The 1956 Studebaker reports, enjoyed if you were expert. This scheme developed in the office and was fully worked out and detailed, but was delayed and not finally built until I'd left the office. This was because the road scheme became in doubt and was finally cancelled, but while it was going through the period of doubt, it might have possibly had some different alignment, and they didn't want to commit themselves to the building until it was clear. But this was built, although I was sad not to be as directly involved as I might have been with it being put together finally. That's shortly after it was completed. Very, very simple arrangement of big balconies, generous living areas facing the balconies, and the large garden within which there were to be communal areas, essentially family accommodation. Underneath at the back, parking, and the obvious reference is the Algiers scheme, but it was very difficult to orchestrate such an ambitious section as was achieved in Algiers. The plans here are typical of ones that we did in other situations. The family apartment with entrance, very simple hall, bedrooms at the back, living area here with a shared connection, and kitchen dining, big balcony. Very, very simple. We struggled for hours to make them so that you hardly noticed that they'd been planned. This was the former building, which was no person's building. Again, very, very simple flats. How you made the corner influenced by looking at the Nice plans of the tower buildings in Chicago. We struggled for hours to try and achieve something that you might not notice. And they stand up. They're a bit decrepit in some ways, but fairly simple buildings. The GLC passed the ownership on to another authority. I'm not quite sure how it's looked after now, but the people who took it on decided that it needed some kind of revamping a few years ago. And it's got a kind of roof collaged onto it, which I've got mixed feelings about. If there'd been more money to spend, I would definitely have done something about the back rather than mess around with the roof, but there we are. Another scheme from that period, and this is uniquely the responsibility of Jeremy Dixon. I wasn't involved with this, incidentally talked about it, but didn't contribute to it. And that was the Plough Way scheme, and he may talk about it more when he's doing his lecture. This was a project for the Sutton Dwellings Trust, and it was most carefully crafted by Jeremy with a very, very thorough analysis of the brief and ingenious juggling of various budgets and systems together to set up a building which was very, very well provided for. It was based on the argument that the intent was to provide lifts in a position where each lift served two flats and on each floor. And that was very, very rare at the time. A lot of British public housing can be interpreted from the understanding that lifts were seen as very, very expensive. The balcony access flats, the elaborate games with routing systems are all based on the fact that you had to make one lift do an enormous amount of work. And in this building, it was seen as almost sacrilege that you could have one lift that actually served just two flats on each floor. But he managed to sort out equations to do it by using a cheap foreign lift, which had much simpler gate systems than the ordinary British lifts, which were partly dogged by costs because they had to have such elaborate door arrangements. Anyway, these simple lifts seem to work very, very well, and the flats have worked fairly well, although I note that they have now been changed. On the right, in the course of building, a slide I took with the large openings to what was to be a communal garden on the roof of the garage block. Now, on the left, the big openings have been blocked and rather mean windows placed, which I think is a great pity in the scheme. But maybe the glazing was just too much. And then a project by Mike Gold, which I had some incidental connection with, worked on for a while, but it's really driven by Mike. And that's very near here, and I think it's possibly the best scheme that was done at the time by us as a group. And this is Clipston Street Housing, which was done for Westminster, and it's very straightforward. It's a ring building with apartments which face a centre garden, and then a triangular building which has a series of workshop, studio, office spaces on the top. and has spaces underneath that work to the street. Hilary, who's here, was actually worked in that building. You could comment on it. On the left, the building in the process of coming out of the ground. On the right, the court as it is now. And the garden really works very, very well. If there are problems with the scheme, they're to do with the lack of imagination of the people who put the briefs together. When we came to do these schemes, they were already prescribed by people from the valuers and estates offices of the local authorities who bought the sites, wrote the briefs, and defined the densities and so forth. And then we were engaged to deal with the design. And the major problem that was not dealt with in this scheme was how there might have been some street-level activity on the outside of the building. But for the living accommodation that is around the garden, it all works very, very well. On the right is an early plan where there were flats. This was a centre corridor which had generous family flats on one side against two smaller flats on the other side. This was superseded by a scissors arrangement which allowed you to enter to a flat which ran over the corridor, so the corridor ran every other level. In this arrangement, it would have meant that some people had north-facing rooms only, which was not satisfactory. Of the other schemes at that time, just to briefly note this one and one other, this one on the left, which is in North London, a strange project by Mike Gold, which was to respond to a local authority that was concerned about large villas in Tufnell Park, which seemed to take up a lot of site. And the idea was put forward that more could be provided, but in a house form. And the technique was to run a second street parallel to the main street with houses either side of that street, presenting their backs to the old main street. An odd arrangement, really, which perhaps devalues the main street. At one end of the system, a big block, which is here, an old big building with smaller apartments in it. And when these drawings were put together, it was a time when we were working on the Milton Keynes project, so on the wall of the apartment. That drawing was done slightly later than the actual design drawing. On the wall of the apartment, there's actually a picture of the Milton Keynes scheme. Carl Eaton Road. The big block, Darren Court as it's known, is I think a tremendously strong piece, and that's uniquely Mike Gold. Much of this work was published in an edition of AD in 1972, June 1972, and on the right was a summary sheet that we prepared, which is probably very, very difficult to read, which tried to pick out about 20 schemes, whatever, that we'd done over about 5 years. Not all built. It also had information on the bottom right of 2 other projects, one of which I'll refer to. This is one of the schemes that didn't win anything, wasn't built, but it's interesting, I think, to refer to. It was the Portsdown housing competition. And what typically happened between us as friends was that we, as I said earlier, combined to do things, taking the same brief but producing different projects. And in here that we've got on the left the project which Ed Jones and Mike Gold produced for Portsdown Housing. On the right, a project which I produced with Adrian Sanson. And I think the better scheme was the Ed Mike scheme. And it's a great pity it wasn't built. Of its time, it was a very, very strong project indeed, I think. It's a series of houses stepping down the hill with a larger block at the back, monumentally facing out to the sea. In terms of preoccupations at this time, we were very hooked, as many other people were, on France, partly because it was south and warmer, and it was in contrast to England, but also because of the situation that still somehow existed, that France, I think, was to do with more relaxed and civilized ways of living compared with the kind of cold dryness of England. I think in a strange way this is now reversed. England's much more relaxed and like France used to be, and France is rather strict and managerial and dry. But on those various trips which were to re-nourish our spirits, we also looked at things like the grid towns. And a book I remember being influential was the Laverdam book on French architecture. And that certainly inspired me to go and look at Richelieu, which is here on the left. Otherwise, projects like the Pierre Charot and Bivert house in Paris for Dr. d'Alsace were fascinating. I remember visiting this with John Miller and Alan Cahoon when it was still occupied by Dr. d'Alsace, whatever it was, 20, 30 years after it had been built. Another influence, and this is leading into next scheme, was big-scale French landscape. Having enjoyed big dimensions of buildings in London, and also enjoying English landscape, I certainly had a hunger for what had been destroyed in English landscape, which is the big-scale formality before the English landscape romantic tradition, but the big-scale formality which existed in French gardens. Also in French influences, I would include projects like this, the Baudouin and Lod's school at Suresnes on the edge of Paris, with a kind of straightforwardness of the idea that you might go from classroom to classroom in the air, through the trees, that the walkway system would take you above the ground. No problem. And these, I think, had an influence, these projects that I've just been going through, had an influence on this scheme, which I did with Jeremy Dixon in 1968, and it was the Runcorn Housing Competition. We didn't win it, but we were commended in it. And what inspired it was the idea of establishing a grid of roads and routes on undulating landscape. So while it's a very, very regular geometry, a very, very regular system, it's against ground which is moving, so that every part of it would be different. And it was done, I think, in a rather doctrinaire way, and would have possibly been very unpleasant if built. But we did it to pursue the idea and see where it led, and we're rather surprised to get into the second stage of the competition. Elspeth Hamilton and I were away in France when Jeremy sent a postcard about having gotten to the second stage, a telegram, which as a joke he wrote backwards. So it said nuck nor no or something. And I wasn't quite sure whether it meant that it wasn't on or it was on. But anyway, we came back and then went on with the project for the second stage. But we were obviously interested here in the play of the formal system of the streets and the buildings with looser arrangements for the planting, which obviously relates to the English landscape tradition. An interlude at this time was certainly for me the building of the Tatlin Tower, which was a collective project, initially through Jeremy Dixon, Chris Woodward, and me, but many other people became involved with it. And this was for an exhibition called Art in Revolution, which was done at the Hayward Gallery. And Michael Braun, who was involved with the organising group, had suggested to Jeremy, who already had a reputation as a model maker, that he might be able to contribute a model which was about 4 feet high for the exhibition. And Jeremy rather rashly suggested, why not make it 40 feet high? But this was a suggestion made, I think, in November, when the exhibition opened at the end of January. And so we set out, while we had regular jobs doing other things, of course, to build this 40-foot high reproduction of the Tatlin Tower. And having said we do it, we immediately had a difficulty, which was that there were no defined drawings as to what it was like. All the drawings that Tatlin had left were in contradiction to each other. And there was no way of agreeing what the right version was. So just going back, on the left here was a model that was made, primarily Jeremy, to try and define the thing as best as possible. And that model was about this high. And we then literally scaled up from that to make the complete thing for the South Bank. We were given access to the Hayward Gallery main gallery for a period of about a month to try and build it. And nobody else was in the building really very much. We used to go down there days and nights and do this with the security guards around us. And we took lots of sound system stuff in, and it was all rather enjoyable, except the security guards were at times difficult. We'd have a drawing, a sketch to do with building the things that we put on the wall, and then the security guards would stop us taking it off the wall because they had to protect things on the walls. But essentially, we prefabricated the thing in the gallery around a staging, took it down, took it outside, and erected it whole. And in the final erection, all sorts of people came to help, including students from Kingston that Elspeth Hamilton brought in, and she put the final flag on the top. It was a wonderful thing to do, a terrific spirit about it. If you're trying to build something in your house, nobody wants to help you. If you want to build something which is public, all sorts of people will come and help. But we had to work through the night at the end. Going to other work, the work at McManus's was something that we felt had a good run. It was about a 5-year stint, certainly as far as I was concerned, and at the point where certainly I was getting itchy feet, opportunities came up for doing other things. And I think it was through Malcolm McEwen that there was a recommendation to Derek Walker, who had become the chief architect at Milton Keynes. And Derek phoned up and said, where we interested to go and try and work on the Newtown project. Initially Mike Gold and I went, and then others joined later. When Mike and I went, first of all, the town was in a very early state. Nothing had been built to speak of, and there were about 20, 30 people talking about what the possibilities for its building were. I think the rough cut of the first period was that the architects had all sorts of ideas about how they might do it, while the engineers got on and did it. And certainly the early work that Mike Gold and I did, which was to try and straighten up the grid roads, build on both sides of the grid roads, make crossings across the grid road, where entirely all that led to nothing. And the town became committed to the system of wavy roads and isolated sites, which it currently has. We, having moved from trying to think about the town as a whole, not very effectively, we then moved to consider a particular site, which was the Netherfield site. It became called Netherfield. I hate these pseudo-English early names, but that's what we worked on. And in approaching this, I noted just these as possible influences. Jeremy had been working at the Smithsons, and one of the projects at the end of that run was the Robin Hood Lane housing, which has this giant mound in the middle. And the possibility of buildings against mounded landscape was certainly an influence for us. The other piece on the right is a Leonardov drawing, and his drawings were very, very fascinating at the time. What we produced for the Netherfield project was this, essentially. This was the master plan for it. It was looking for some kind of equation that would allow a whole series of... They had to be cheap local authority houses to be built in a situation where every house faced a park, a generous park, a big open space on one side, and on the other side it had the potential for an intimate area, a small area, a garden. And we looked for a way of accommodating all the different briefs that we were given, the different sizes of accommodation, by taking advantage of the flow of the land, so that the small units worked here at the top of the hill, the highest ground, large units at the bottom of the hill. And we did this by establishing along the terrace runs a datum, a horizontal level. Certainly a direct influence for this was the Vauxhall's Parts factory or works, which is still up the M1 as you go on your right, just before you come to the Toddington service station, where the shed has a big horizontal roof with the ground working against it. That may seem corny, but we found that a useful reference. The project was about many, many terrace houses, very, very simple terrace houses, and it went through an elaborate planning stage, which was to do with establishing the layout of the main grids, and then allowing flexible ways in which the spaces between the grids could be infilled. There are here arrangements for school, such would be done by the local authority. The local centre, such would be done by Head Jones. other educational arrangements here, clubs, etc., various things. The idea was that things could be added in the future as they were going to prove necessary. The scheme was, in the slide on the left, part of a bigger project which was to do with the valley, the low land, which had water running either side of it. And attached to the idea was a whole series of sinuous building that would work along beside the water. We never actually pursued that ourselves, but it was pursued by Pete Barker and Susie Wheeler. The Netherfield scheme on the right, coming out of the ground, it had a very insistent arrangement of divisions between the terrace houses, which were to help with the privacy of the houses and give some kind of architectural definition to the scheme. And I think we were certainly inspired by the systems within Georgian buildings that gave definition, but didn't want to use references so directly from that period. There was a slightly cynical arrangement to do with the building of the thing, because Milton Keynes was keen to draw in big contractors to do work, and we had to design the thing with the possibility that it might have been made out of brick, concrete, wood, anything you can imagine, really. In the end, it was built with a timber frame party wall system, which is an odd thing to do. Within the models that were made, the slide on the left is of one of the subgroups of housing with gardens at the back and finding a space within the gardens. Definitely to do with Georgian references here. On the right, some of the house plans, and again, as in earlier work and as in the Maxwell comments, an interest to bring in planting to somehow soften the regular systems. Models of the houses at the extreme of the slope where the levels changed. And then the scheme starting to come out of the ground. On the right, the model. On the left, the thing as it was starting to build, which is disconcertingly like the model. The space moving here at the back. We look for all sorts of ways of enriching the rear spaces. Slide on the left gives a sense of the idea of the scheme disappearing over the hill. And in fact, the land at one point is higher than the roof of the buildings. So it was intended to contrast the formal front on the left with the do-it-yourself, whatever you like, arrangement at the back on the right. The formal front with the fins, which were made of GRP, and metallic and wood cladding to the timber frame system. At the back, wood cladding to the system. This was a project then that was developed for an adjoining site by Mike Gold, and Pete Barker worked with him on it, Coffee Hall. And this had very generous wide-fronted houses in it, as the model here. And these were built more traditionally. One of the things that sustained me enormously at this time, I really enjoyed, was that it was possible to live in the middle of London and also have a kind of life out of London. I'd followed a kind of progression, which is to want to live near and near the centre of the city, and had begun off in Gospel Oak, moved to Chalk Farm, moved to Camden Town, moved to Percy Street just across the road here, looked seriously at a flat on the edge of Piccadilly Circus, but very, very committed to the idea of trying to live right in the centre of the city. But I was very, very fortunate to be able to complement this with Elspeth by going to a flat that she had set up in Somerset in an old decaying country house. It was only in a very small part of the house, but it was in the most stunning landscape, and it is a great luxury to have been able to enjoy these two extreme experiences. And a lot of the work was done sitting in that place, looking out at this landscape. It was also a place which many friends came to, and that's Alan Cahoon looking rather less respectable than he does now on the right, talking seriously to Mike Gold. And I suppose it might be worth saying, just in reference to the slide on the left, that it was a period of very easy social contact between people doing quite different things. And on the left was going on a Sunday morning to the inflating of the Norman Foster office in Hemel Hempstead, which was being the temporary office which he built, which was blown up by a small pump. I left Milton Keynes, however, before Netherfield was very much complete, because I felt that the office there was not one I wished to continue in, and I was uneasy about what the future involvement with the new town could be, and I felt I wanted to work in a different kind of way. And I left and set up a practice with Adrian Sansom, who has unfortunately died now. But Adrian was a very, very good friend and colleague for a long time, and a very, very good compliment. And he had worked at the London Borough of Hounslow and bought into private practice projects from them. And these were projects at a very, very different scale, very, very practical, and fairly tough lines about the use of materials and the situations in which we could build. It's a small project at Swan Road in Hounslow. Ed Jones and Jeremy and the others stayed rather longer at Milton Keynes. But we got together to put this project in for competition entry. This was the Northampton Civic Hall. The initial scheme was done by Jeremy Dixon, and I drew it up with him. And we got into the second stage of the competition. When it came to the next stage, Blitz, I wasn't so able to give as much time as other people, and it was Ed Jones and Jeremy who primarily developed it. I came and helped in the last period, as did many, many others. The final push was an orchestrated month with about 6 or 8 people working day and night to put together a very, very thorough set of drawings. I was very sorry that it was a scheme that didn't go ahead. It had unfortunately been commissioned by one local authority party, and there was a local election, and another party was elected, and they immediately cancelled the scheme, having won the competition. But on the basis of winning the competition and the prize that went with it, we set up an office together in Covent Garden. This scheme was a very simple arrangement, an office building which had the council chamber at the top for the ceremonial function, with the access system up the outside to get to that chamber. And it had the public gallery at the top, so that the public would always be above the councillors. It had a few other touches, like the shaft which went through to the desk of the treasurer, and it was intended to take the sun on April the 5th at the end of the financial year, or start of the financial year. So at that point, the sun, at a key time, would shine down the shaft onto the desk of the treasurer to remind him that his responsibilities shouldn't be considered too narrowly. No, I don't think it was. Anyway, on the basis of this and the optimism that it might go ahead, we established ourselves in the Earlham Street warehouse on a floor which had been taken by the AA. I was telling Alan Balfour about this earlier when he was saying that the AA is now looking, it has some space where students may work. This floor had also been an AA space, but what happened was that while students worked there initially, their friends and lovers then came in to work there as well, and then they seemed to go, and the friends and lovers were left there. And they also put up partitions and things, and it became very impenetrable. And finally the AA had this sort of piece of real estate, which was nothing very much to do with the AA. Anyway, the AA gave it up, and it was cleared out, and Christina Smith, who owned the building, agreed to rent it to us. And we took the whole floor, laid a green carpet, made a lot of chipboard worktops, and set about being the office that was going to build the Northampton Pyramid. But the scheme didn't go ahead. We did, though, do other work. On the left a project for Christina Smith for building on the roof of that warehouse. And this was initially generated by Mike Gold with Ed Jones, and I subsequently took it forward, but it never got built. We began to work at rather different scales. This was partly exigency, but also to do with, certainly as far as I was concerned, an interest to not do giant schemes. I think prematurely we were working at very big scale, and if a reasonable criticism of some of the work is that while it's enjoyable to do direct, straight work, there's also a point where there's kind of emptiness about it. And I felt I needed to enrich myself by doing smaller things. And this was a small infill project for the London Borough of Haringey on the left, built very traditionally. This was another scheme from Hounslow. I'm sorry the slides aren't very good, which turned up in the office at a point where Adrian Sansom was rather unwell, and it was not possible to handle it, and I was under pressure, and I suggested that Ed took it, and he developed this old person's housing near London Airport. And we all did entries for the Millbank competition. This on the left was the key drawing for the project I did with Elspeth Hamilton, and there are then the other schemes which I can briefly show you. I certainly regarded this as an opportunity to try and work with different considerations. I was much more aware, we were all much more aware of the importance of valuing the context of architecture, and we developed a sense that there was everything to be gained from working from patterns of building that existed in certain areas. And in this case, the scheme was to try and extend the existing square that existed up here across the main road to then turn it to line the river. It's a very, very simple scheme, done very, very quickly. We literally spent a day to do the drawings and rushed it in. It didn't win the competition, but it was refreshing to do it, and one of the things that was refreshing was doing it quickly and having to make drawings which are not hard-line ink drawings, which almost all our other drawings had been. On the left, the scheme that Ed Jones produced for the same project, and on the right, the scheme by Mike, which had as key element this tower, which went to a glowing piece at the top. There was intended to be a kind of diamond on the top. Mike was very, very interested in pieces that might culminate buildings, and in the earlier project I talked about, the Clipson Street project, he was very interested in the end of the triangular building, and at one point the intention was to sharpen the end, so you had quite a large building which came to a point, and the point was quite dangerous. You could cut your finger on it. It was like a knife edge, but this wasn't appreciated by the clients. But in this case, there was the idea that the building came to a point at the top which would glitter, that there would be a diamond there. Jeremy Dixon produced the scheme on the left, which was very, very elaborately and thoroughly done, and less tongue-in-cheek perhaps than the others. And I incidentally note on the right the scheme which John Miller and Alan Cahoon did, who we had good contact with at the time. I'm not going to go on very much longer because this is really, in my mind, something about early work, and to go into things that have happened since for me would be another lecture, and it might become too extended for you. But I'll just briefly say that it was certainly my view by the early to mid-70s that in a way what had happened was that it had been quarrying something established in education, very much to do with the contact with Alan Cahoon and ideas generated afterwards, and that we went through all these various ideas and explored them perhaps as fully as they might have gone, and it was then necessary to look freshly and consider other things and perhaps make other moves. And one of the ways that helped me certainly think about this was teaching in America. I've been 4 or 5 times to America, particularly 2 sessions at Cornell, which I enormously valued. And one of the things about going on these stints is that you're not overpressured in your direct student contact, and you have access to these amazing libraries that the the libraries in America, on the whole, have much better books than the libraries in this country do. If you want to find out about England or France or Italy, it's a very, very good thing to go into an American architecture school library. And so, sitting in upstate New York with the snow piled around the window, I felt I started to learn about things in architecture which I hadn't understood before. And also to become engaged in a conversation about architecture, very seriously conducted by people like Colin Rowe. Some of this is very easy to caricature now, but it was hatching in, filling in areas of experience which I hadn't sufficiently touched. And certainly the AA at the time was very well spirited. There were terrific things going on in the units, but it was essentially amateur, if you like. It wasn't underpinned by scholarship. There was no time. Nobody could actually spend day and night being a thorough academic in the AA context as it existed there and then, and I'm not sure if that can happen now. And there are problems about being a thorough academic. You can get over-introverted and narrowly scholastic, but it certainly was, for me, healthy to come in contact with people who had a rather different background and were, in a way, more serious, more rigorous about education than people in this country. American education at that time had a kind of old-fashioned Germanic rigor. The students were much more obedient. It was definitely old-fashioned compared with what was going on in England, but it was space to find things. There were also irreverent things happening as well. I particularly enjoyed going with Dave Etherton. We were looking at something in Yale, and we came across there were some guys who were repairing the electricity around this tank with the lipstick on it, the Oldenburg, in a student housing scheme. And the way in which they were talking about the wiring arrangement with this preposterous object next to them was something engaging, I thought. Couldn't happen in Oxford. And really coming out of all that was a kind of these are two extreme examples. It was work that was preoccupied by the contrast between the interest in buildings in space and buildings that enclose space. And these are just the contrasting entries for the Le Havre, for the Moscow project with the Perret scheme on the left and the Korb scheme on the right. Perret doing the scheme which simply enclosed the space, left the space. A dumb scheme in some ways, but absolutely in contrast to the Korb scheme. This is just running out on America. So we might have the lights on, and just briefly to finish with one or two things. Perhaps we don't need the lights. I can read off this. Just to touch on teaching, I began teaching here with Jeremy Dixon in 1973, and the work we did at the beginning was very much to do with, I think, looking to counterpoint our own, perhaps, over-seriousness in the earlier projects. And we were very concerned that students should try almost anything and take anything to an extreme. And the key thing was to discriminate and find their own positions and their own sense of style. And that was a good period. It was very, very positive in all sorts of ways. When I taught a bit later here, then from 76 to 80, in the first year, I was much more engaged by the serious questions about how you put together a curriculum and what kind of issues you ought to deal with in the early stages of an architecture program. That perhaps in retrospect, the work with Jeremy was opportunist, and we didn't really consider anything like a kind of overall curriculum context for what we were doing. In 1980, at the end, I moved to the Royal College and worked there for 5 years. 79, I moved and worked there for 6 years with John Miller and Sue Rogers, and that was on the back of a curriculum established by them with Ken Frampton, and I very, very much enjoyed that. I think that was a positive experience. They had set up an arrangement where essentially students at a postgraduate level, at a fourth year level by AA reckoning, went back to the beginning again. And we worked from very elemental house projects in the first year through to more elaborate projects, but against a background that architecture should be seen with urban design, landscape and interior design as all one enterprise. and that we had a lot of debate about what an overarching view could be about about projects to cover that. And a piece of writing that was put together nicely described what we were doing as being in some way looking between designing as the result of a value-free methodology that's kind of happened automatically, and designing as something magic that you couldn't explain. You were just the midwife, and suddenly the scheme turned up, and there was no way of talking about how it had happened or why it had happened. And this comes back again now as something which is important, I think, as schools, certainly in the public sector system, are under increasing pressure to define what they're doing. Architectural education has had a very open and free context to work in, and has been able to make its own rules. The management ideas which are driving education now in the public sector don't like this, and they want the outcomes of education to be predictable, and then the teaching arrangements to be organised to achieve those predictable outcomes. Marina's eyes are glazing over. She knows this story. But it's, I think, quite a good challenge for those people who have a connection with education to take on what all this means. Otherwise, since the work that I've shown here, I've really enjoyed myself enormously doing all sorts of projects, primarily at a smaller scale, and I'm very, very touched that Wasfi Khani, who has been a client for some of these projects, came tonight. But thank you very much.
We have a few minutes. If anybody has any comments or questions, are you happy to take them?
Absolutely. Complete silence. I think that's true.
And actually, what's interesting is that in schools there is a resurgence of programs of human social.
Yeah.
And I think what I find very destructive about labour, or the event, not just in education, but generally, is that, say, unlike Portugal, where the relationship between generations is understood as being profitable, beneficial, and that the work of the previous generation isn't dismissed. Here, there's been a curious commitment to ideas of whether it is worth more novelty. So I think the purpose of this lecture, or the effect of this lecture program, is to re-establish the importance of this work. Because we live in a country which habitually downplays the intellectual efforts and personal commitments of architects, specifically through kind of ideas. It's staggering importance of this lecture takes place, and the willingness to do it. That's more than significant.
I appreciate what you're saying, and certainly what I would say about it is that it was never ever in my mind that the point of being involved at all was to act in the world in some way. That architecture only has meaning because you try and work in the world, and that architecture is a hermetic event or something that you might just consider for your colleagues and friends and mentors is something I could never see any point in.
I think there's a possibility of state affairs now existing where the critical positioning that you describe, the education of students in schools have learned to adopt broadly, and the kind of imprecision which you now know is also the basis of any action, which, to be fair, as modern movement architects, you subscribe to, whereas my generation was cut back through by Venturi, like that. But this position of an understanding of my understanding, actual impossibility of concrete bases such as we're attuned, combined with a desire to begin again to make work which is communicative of ideas from relationship with work and society. I think your result is something very, very interesting. Because I think that much of the criticism that we learned at the moment was that its inability to be critical and in a way also to be generous to very simple human desire. I don't want to be critical of what was done, because I'd like to quote Peter SMITHSON when he was talking about, he responded to a comment about debt housing by the critic, person in the audience, that didn't you know it was stupid? And he said, well, just haven't know it's stupid. And his point was that for example, development housing and Western Grove was a massive failure initially. It was seen as very, very poor housing from its construction right through to the 1950s when Roger May took those photographs of it, where you wouldn't actually take people back to your apartment if you didn't have those photos, because they were so effective. And then gradually there was a recovery and economic recovery and gentrification, for example. And those houses now are seen as the absolute perfect form to live. And we forget many, many years when we consider utter mistakes. I think there's a time period where architecture suffered very greatly. And in a sense, we've internalized that, even architects have internalized that view. And I'd like to open that as something we should reconsider, especially seeing this work, which is of its time. I think, of course, you must know criticism, but I think the integrity of it, having just come back from seeing how extreme in Rotterdam, of extremely simple plan, which in our case achieved fantastic poetry. I forgot the point I was going to make, but I think the concept of what's is very, very important to today.
No, well, it's a good point to make, I think. I have many criticisms and things I could say about the work which would suggest that there are problems with it, but in a way I don't want to do that. I think that it's a sort of immaturity to be overcritical about your past. You accept it, and what I think is important about it, and it's the kind of thing you discover in retrospect, is that it was driven by an idea that at a certain level architecture might be very straightforward and not it might not be too complicated and difficult a business to achieve buildings, and that in a way it would be better if it was like that, and that it might be a good thing that you didn't keep having to pay attention to them. You quietly appreciated them, but they were in the end the settings for a life you led that was more concerned with other things. In the end, architecture isn't very important. There's a great danger of overdoing it. It's far less important than eating well and the relationships you have with people.
I appreciate very much the first question or statement made along why it was. And I also appreciate very much Paul's teaching information and its very honest description of the work done. I was a student here actually when you were teaching in the intermediate school, and I remember that the other teachers in the rank were people like Pete Critchlow, Brian Anderson, who said, hang up the door of all the people who don't do anything, died under
design. If you went there, you were just some serious design profession. I think the latest in my lecture did that. Sort of around the masters, people have actually to run through that practice, and it's been my sort of eternal disappointment that I didn't actually go into that when I was in this later on. So having said that, the changes that are taking place in the context of in which work is done, I think is so interesting. I want to link this straight back to the Finnish series of last term. But the municipal housing programs are apparently completely around Patrick Hodgkins was saying to me as a tutor of mine in the fifth year. Well, when he left UAA, he expected municipal housing programs commissioned on the authority. It's beyond anybody's imagination nowadays. And with those municipal housing programs, of course, came a far richer reach than anybody would believe possible from Tarmac or anybody else today. Alternative procurement methods, for example, design and build, bring a completely different agenda to the table than anything that you might have expected at that time. So I think the social agenda, which is in decline and almost to political statements of post-Thatcherite era, we appear to have a deeply depressed social agenda in the conversation, best cope to a local authority might be that Section 106 was tagged on the end of the Planning Commission of course, in the work. So I'd have interest in just knowing whether you see any hope in the present as opposed to the one which you were involved in. But this one last one is that I think the humility and decency of the way in which you say this lecture walks north, work walks north, and of course early immature work, and yet it stands there today with character and form. But you've got it out, you've got it built. There isn't much room for experimental architecture. To live on and be used forever. You've got it out, it's built in. It's many respects it's good to test the time. And I think that humility, which I know to be in you, one finds isn't in some of the work, despite your obvious awareness, although you say perhaps it isn't truly academic, your obvious awareness of the how and garden, the progression of English philanthropic born out of the whole social agenda and the new roots movement. That was obviously there and implicit in your work, but the work carried sort of a regimented and doctrinaire approach to it, an inflexibility in it, a lack of romanticism, which maybe uses an elusive context of spiritual work. And I wonder if you think that is because you were applying the rules rigidly to develop the project, or whether it is in part due to the fact that you were just burdened with such tremendous opportunity at a more immature stage of your career.
That sounds good. That sounds good. Yes, earlier stage. That's better. That's much better.
You might want to think of that, don't you?
Yes. Well, I think that, in retrospect, you might say that for an office to give people who were 2 years out of school giant schemes to do, which affected lots and lots of people's lives with great latitude as to how they were done, was either wonderfully enlightened or foolhardy. And I suspect it's a combination of the two. I think one of the situations we found ourselves in a strange way, was that there was a generation of older people who didn't know what to do. I think this is a general characteristic of the 60s, who trusted anybody who was young to have a better idea. In some way things were allowed to happen in a way that's very, very difficult to imagine now. I personally think a lot of the work is very naive, and I wince at some of the things in it when I go and see it. But I appreciate what's driving it, and I don't mind that. I think it's all right. And it's not clear to me that there wouldn't be situations that could be found now, even though I think it's more difficult, where it's possible to act as an architect. And it wouldn't be doing schemes like that. but the level of involvement and the preferences and the degree of demonstrativeness could be judged and acted out now, I think. One thing that has really annoyed me, well, one might go on. I didn't see it, but I heard accounts of it, and that was the Architecture Armageddon programme. And by the account of that, it really irritates me. And Martin Pawley was one of the people who wrote in this edition of the AD. He coined the phrase "the lost generation," and at a certain level, he's part of a terrible problem in architecture, as I think Banham was. It's an irony that Banham is in the room next door, but Banham sowed the seed, I think, of some of the things which are, for instance, in this AD. I can bring you out a quote, which was talking about this AD was a very, very snide thing to do, that they invited us to submit work and they published it, and they then put up at the front of it a really critical essay about the work by Walter Siegel, essentially saying this is pointless work. You know, why on earth are people messing around doing this? And in the editorial, which was, I think, Robin Middleton, he's referring to what Siegel says, but he says, "But as Siegel so clearly sees, such architecture will no longer do. An unbridgeable gulf separates us from the men who met at La Sarraz in 1928. An awkward expressionist phase has flourished, particularly in America and France during the past decade, but it is not this that has created the gulf. Rather than the recognition that all such architectural expression, whether Puritan or Baroque, is irrelevant. It's the idea that architecture couldn't continue in some way, and that I think that was which came from Banham, and the beginning, that was the beginning of this kind of opposition between the possible connection between what you did as a student and what you might do in practice. You know, that it was impossible to see some easy way of connecting, that it was a negative attribute to look to make a connection, not a positive one. And there's a generation of people in this country who are looking for some hopeless kind of fulfillment. They're interested in architecture, but they will not acknowledge what its essential nature is likely to be and go with it. You know. I could list a whole lot of people who would come within that, and I think their comments have been very damaging and destructive. But certainly it's been my experience is that there are an enormous lot of people who are interested in architecture. If only they could make connections to architects who could be helpful to them, they would love to be involved with it. I have endless contact with people who really value it, and that's the connection that architects have to try and make. I don't think that architecture's over, or that we're in some terminal cultural state of decline.
Just in passing, that one comment that our questioner made, not the latter one about the picturesque tradition and the trajectory of British architecture from Ebenezer Howard through one particular line, but actually in relation to procurement strategies and design building and other considerations in relation to the work that we've seen this evening, where I think there's an interesting connection for me between that part of the conversation and the conversation that we had here on Friday night last week, at which Robert Mull, who's come into the room now, was participating, where Katrina Beaver and Robert Mull made their foyer competition entry around strategies of procurement as much as strategies of different kinds of social activity that might take place within and around the building that they were proposing, where there was a very interesting interlocking, it seemed, for me in particular, between ideas which they drew from situationist practice in the late 50s and early 60s in France, and its radical intentions in relation to the emerging modern city, turning them on their head in a way, and representing them to a city like Birmingham now as it enters a phase in its development where, because of modernist strategies like focus on infrastructure, focus on kind of small scale contingent, localized building operations, and the building of, on the other hand, very large pieces with no consideration for adjacencies and so on, as the city slides in a way towards a condition which is very much like all cities anywhere, what Anthony Vidler, in his post-urbanism essay, which was published in The Architectural Uncanny, calls the city with no name, where he quotes from Colin that there are connections that have been made by a younger generation, which picks up on themes made by a slightly older generation. Really not. The gap is not so
slightly
great.
older.
Yes.
The
gap is not so great in a way. There's an interesting reworking of themes that is, I think, quite different from the reworking of themes that was, say, done by Peter Wilson and others in the 80s here, where in their practice, paradoxically, from my point of view, they seem to be going back over Venturi, Rauch, Scott Brown's work and so on, representing it in the shape of kindergartens and other small projects, in a way that a generation now seems to be going back over some other territory, which was from a slightly earlier period, and representing that in an extraordinarily vigorous way. And I think this is true not just in pockets within the AA, but also within other schools in London. And I think that North London University in particular is very strong in this respect. And so there is a very kind of interesting kind of and curious reciprocity between generations, which has gaps between one generation and another, but where there is a kind of productive revisiting, which brings out something new. So I wrote a piece which I think is going to come out in BD this week, I'm not sure, which was called Death Games, which quoted from John Haydock's Architecture and the Pathonomic, where he talks about one of the characteristics of the pathological condition of the discipline is listening at the gravesite of architectures of the past, putting your ear to the ground and kind of and digging away, a kind of over-insistent kind of exploration into the past on the one hand. He talks about a kind of narrowing of vision, an overemphasis on detail, a preoccupation with architecture as something. Not architecture as architecture, but architecture as medicine, or architecture as biology, or architecture as whatever it is, X-ray, photography, film. But what seems to be happening in contradiction to that is actually something else, which is a kind of revaluing of architecture as architecture. And I think it's very pertinent that it's possible to have over a month a kind of a re-investigation of a previous generation's early work, when architecture was worked through as architecture, where the nods were in the direction of other architects' work, which were very explicitly stated, and where the work was fruitful and vigorous. And I think that's to me is so interesting about this month. I don't know whether I want to give Chris the last word, but I think actually we've come to the end. Would you like to?
Two philosophical points. One is, yes, I knew McManus vaguely. If you look at McManus's very early things, they're arts and crafts. There's an extraordinary house in Green Pantown on the edge of Garden Suburb, which is actually a pillar to post work at Lancaster, deeply true, with George Bernard Shaw walking past the front, famous cartoon. And that was where he